Welcome again to this time to our third lecture in the series, The Power to Move, Books and Works of Art That Have Changed Our Lives. I'm really pleased that you're all here. I'm going to ask you, as always, to turn off your cell phones if you haven't remembered to do that quite yet. Maybe it'll be nice to be for an hour and a half out of the loop. No one's calling you. Tonight, I'm very, very pleased to be able to introduce to you Professor Dan Spencer. He was here last week, as you recall, and was involved in our discussion with Professor Shearer last week. Professor Spencer has been here on campus since 2002. He works in the Environmental Studies Department, and there he is an associate professor now. He's had a couple of lifetimes, I think, before this. I hope he has at least 9 like a cat, because I really like him in this one anyway. Actually, the last time Dan was gave one of these lectures, we had each lecturer tell something that nobody else knew about him or her that I could share with the group. And I didn't get any really revelatory comments, I'll have to tell you. You know, you just don't want to share too much with an intimate group of 200 friends. But Dan did say that I might mention that in a former life he was a geologist, and as a geologist he found himself in Central America, and he slept one night beside the crater of an erupting volcano. So a risk taker is what we've got here. Also, he's in one of those fields, or in some of those fields, where it really is kind of a risk to be, because you don't know exactly what your job's going to be or what your life work is going to be. Dan is interested in ecology, in the ethics of ecology, religion and ecology, and has a lasting interest in Central America and works on issues of globalization, ecology, and justice in Central America. His advanced degree is from Union Seminary, right? Okay. From Union Seminary. And he's just another one of those people whom we're awfully, awfully fortunate to have with us on campus. So I know that you're going to join me in welcoming him. His topic is also a wonderful one, and a couple of people were wandering in tonight saying, oh, I remember this from when? Rachel Carson and Silent Spring. And I remember it from my sophomore college biology class, when Silent Spring was really still new. I mean, that was about 66 or something like that. But it was really a wave in biology and in the world of how we thought of biology and ourselves. I was looking at a 2002 edition of Silent Spring this morning, and as part of the prologue, a biographer of Rachel Carson has written something which I think sort of applies to our series and why we have Silent Spring in our series and so on. If you'll let me read just one paragraph, I think you may agree. Silent Spring compels each generation to reevaluate its relationship to the natural world. We are a nation still debating the questions it raised. This was written in 2002. Still unresolved as to how to act for the common good, how to achieve environmental justice. In arguing that public health and the environment, human and natural, are inseparable, Rachel Carson insisted that the role of the expert had to be limited by democratic access and must include public debate about the risks of hazardous technologies. She knew then, as we have learned since, that scientific evidence by its very nature is incomplete, and scientists will inevitably disagree on what constitutes certain proof of harm. It is difficult to make public policy in such cases when government's obligation to protect is mitigated by the nature of science itself. So with that, I'm just going to introduce to you Professor Dan Spencer. Dan, thank you for being here, and let's welcome him.
Thanks so much, Linda. How's the volume? Can you hear okay in the back there? Good. All right, that's great. I'm just delighted to be here. Linda mentioned that I've been teaching at the University of Montana since 2002. I first came to Montana in 1974 when I was in high school and my family vacationed in Glacier National Park, and I just got hooked. I spent my summers of both college and graduate school working in Glacier. I later returned for 3 summers as a field geologist here. In fact, I think I spent most of my adult life trying to figure out how to move back to Montana permanently. And I was finally able to do that 8 years ago. So that has really been just a delight. The other thing is, how many folks here are alums of the University of Montana? And this is the alumni series. Good, it's really wonderful. One of the things I really enjoy about teaching at the University of Montana is bumping into alums of the university in all sorts of fascinating places. It's really a delightful group of people. There's never any shortage of people talking about what it was like for them when they were here, any particular time, the professors they had, what was going on there. But I'm really delighted to be giving this talk as part of the alumni lecture series here. Now, I have one other confession to make here. How many of you were here last week for Tobin Shearer's talk? Wasn't it just extraordinary? I mean, it was one of the most breathtaking talks I've seen in a university setting or any other setting here. He did the entire thing without notes. And I kept thinking, how am I going to follow this? This is really good. So I pondered about this quite a bit, and fortunately, National Public Radio came to the rescue for me this week. I was lying in bed one morning, and they were talking about brains, and teenage brains versus middle-aged brains, and how brains mature. And one of the things they talked about was that middle-aged brains are getting to the peak of their powers in terms of analytical ability, but are well past the power in terms of short-term memory. This I know to be true. I have many pages of notes tonight. I wish I could do it like Tobin did, but I don't think I'll be able to. But I'm nonetheless, with any luck, you'll get me at the peak of my analytical powers, but probably not short-term memory. Before I start talking here again, this was a really, really fun lecture to prepare for because I've been teaching about Rachel Carson in some of my classes, but this gave me the opportunity and the excuse to go back and read a lot of her works again and to read a lot of the analysis, both biographies and analysis of her. There's just a lot of stuff out there. I brought a whole bag full of books about Rachel Carson by Rachel Carson here. But I wanted to start by asking, how many of you remember when Silent Spring came out? Okay, we got quite a few folks who remember that. How many of you have read Silent Spring or parts of it? A lot of people have. This is great. How many of you knew about Rachel Carson before Silent Spring? Anybody? That's part of what I want to talk about tonight, is to kind of fill in the gaps, because part of what's not known generally about the Rachel Carson story was that she was already a very highly acclaimed writer before Silent Spring came out. And that's part of what gave her the authority and the confidence of the US population. She had written 3 highly acclaimed science and nature books about the ocean, about the sea. I'll talk about them a little bit. They had won the National Book Award. They had given her financial independence, a lot of things. So she was already a very, very well-established writer, and she saw her whole career as going to be one of being a nature writer. She never anticipated being an expose of what was going on with the petrochemical industry. So that was a big twist and turn. So what I'd like to do tonight in talking about this in the life and legacy of Rachel Carson is trace her life story as a way of illustrating part of what was also going on in the 20th century. Now, if any of you have read Black Elk Speaks, in the opening chapter, Black Elk Speaks, he's responded to John Neihardt, and he says to him, I will tell you the story of my life because that's what you've asked me. But if it were just my own life story, I wouldn't tell it because I'm not any different than anybody else. But I'm paraphrasing badly. But my life story here will illustrate the life of my people and what's been going on there. And so I don't want to go quite that far with Rachel Carson because her life story is extraordinary in itself. But I want you to use it be also using it as what was developing through the 20th century, because Rachel Carson lived her life entirely within the first 2/3 of the 20th century. And she chronicles a lot of the movement of what's going on in the change of US society, science and technology, the role of women. A variety of different things come together in her life. It's an extraordinary life, but it also reshaped fundamental dimensions of American society. And that's what I hope we'll continue to look at tonight here. Now, those of you here last week, whoops, I pressed the wrong button already, and I just started here. Oh dear, so how do I get... Let's try this. John gave me what was supposed to be a foolproof remote, and I've already proved him wrong on that here. All right, does that quote look familiar to anybody? We heard this quote last week. This was the quote that was alleged to, Abraham Lincoln was alleged to have said to Harriet Beecher Stowe at the outbreak of the Civil War. And it's one of the many connections between Rachel Carson and Harriet Beecher Stowe, between Uncle Tom's Cabin and Silent Spring here. This was, in some ways, we don't know whether Lincoln actually said this. We do know that Senator Abraham Ribicoff did say this to Rachel Carson when she was called to give testimony in front of his Senate Committee on Environmental Hazards there. And he had carefully prepared the speech. It was about 100 years, almost to the year, after Lincoln's quote on there, to bring this, to draw attention to the same kind of societal impact that Harriet Beecher Stowe had during the Civil War period and lead up to that, what Rachel Carson was doing at this time here. By this time, as I mentioned, Rachel Carson was known around the world because of her book Silent Spring. It had already been translated in 22 languages at this point. And so she had become quite a well-known person here. And she's credited by many as the catalyst for launching the modern environmental movement in the United States and then eventually around the world. So that's what I want to trace a little bit out with here. Rachel Carson took this quote from Keats's poem, "The sedges withered from the lake and no birds sing," to give us as the allusion, or as both her opening front piece, and then also it's where her title will come from here. And in the opening chapter, which we'll get to in a little bit here, and I'll outline a bit of the book, she raises this question: what has already silenced the voices of spring in countless towns in America? This book is an attempt to explain this. That's how she opens her book. Now, Carson chose this poem to give the title to her book here, and ironically, within less than 2 years of Silent Spring coming out, Rachel Carson had died herself of cancer. So her own voice was silenced very shortly after Silent Spring came out. But what I think is really dramatic is that she chose to break the public silence about what was happening around the issues of pesticides and the petrochemical industry and the influence on the environment, people's lives there, at great cost to herself. As I mentioned, she was a very private person here, had no intention initially there, but she cared so deeply about what was happening to the natural world around her that she spent several years researching and writing Silent Spring in order to break the silence on that. And so what we're going to look at tonight now is Rachel Carson's not-so-Silent Spring, the rise of the green critique, and how she brought this about. And I open with one of her quotes here. "For the first time in the history of the world, every human being is now subjected to contact with dangerous chemicals from the moment of conception until death." And what's dramatic about it, we now know this to be literally true. Every human being, no matter where they live on the planet, they can live in the Arctic, they can live in Nepal, whatever, chemicals have become so pervasive, they have entered the food chain in virtually every place on Earth. And it's true of virtually every other form of life, right? Not only human beings, but this very, very recent change has been so dramatic that it's altering the entire fabric of life on the planet. And that was what Rachel Carson dedicated herself to trying to educate the American public about at the beginning here. Carson recognized that with the rise of modern technology in so many areas, but particularly the rapid development and then application of massive amount of petrochemicals, which had largely not been tested for their effects, particularly their long-term effects, that we had reached a tipping point, as it were, in our ability to alter and fundamentally damage the environment and our own well-being along that point there. We really had changed what was happening at the level of the planet. I'll give you one sense of this that I feel like I'm in the luckiest profession in the world, which is teaching. I get to come in contact with brilliant young minds all the time there, and it's really fun to work with them on things. And in my Nature and Society class, which is an entry-level class, one of the pictures I put up on the screen there, as we're kind of tracing the history of the planet, and coming from a geology perspective, talk about the Earth being about 4.5 billion years old, which is a number so large I can't really even conceive of what it means, but it's really big. And I put up on there one of these pictures of the Earth from satellite at night. And of course, I'm sure you've all seen this. It shows all the metropolitan areas are lit up in there. And so I ask him, I say, for the 4.5 billion years of the Earth's history, how long has this picture been possible from space? About 50 years. About 50 years out of 4.5 billion. That's astonishing when you start to think about that level of impact that human beings are having on the planet. Well, Rachel Carson was pointing to a similar kind of thing. If you were to ask how long in the roughly 3.5 to 4 billion years of life evolving on Earth, how long have synthetic chemicals entered into the food chain and appeared in every form of life on the planet? Maybe 80 years, maybe 60 years, something like that. But Rachel Carson was living through that period, and so she wants to draw our attention to that. And I put up here a quote by my teacher, Larry Rasmussen, who's an environmental ethicist. He has written that what he says the biggest story of the 20th century was the fundamental change in the relationship of the human world to the rest of the earth. Never before have human technology and human numbers been powerful enough to alter and destroy planetary life systems. He refers this sea change to these worlds here, what he calls the wild facts of our current situation. The great new wild fact of our time is that cumulative human activity has the power to affect all life in fundamental and unprecedented ways. Now, for many of us, we've been living with this reality for several decades now, so it's not quite as startling. But in Rachel Carson's time, this was really brand new news for many, many people. And I love the way ethicist Dan McGuire talks about the danger of this. He puts it very short and succinctly. If current trends continue, we will not. Right? It's hard to be much more blunt. And today we think about it in terms of climate change. Rachel Carson talked about it in terms of what was happening with the chemicals in all of life there. But this is the kind of the moral issues here. And so Larry Rasmussen again phrases it like this, that nature is a community is the scientific discovery of the 20th century. We would talk about that today as the rise of ecology, understanding that everything that lives is interdependent in this. It's a community of life. The earth, human society included, is also a community, or that the earth, human society included, is also a community, has not yet registered with us, or at least how to sustain it as a community has not. And so that will be the challenge. Once we have the diagnosis, how do we move from that to responding in this area here? Rachel Carson dedicated her life to first studying and writing about the discovery of nature as a community, and second, to alerting us to the perils it and we face. Now, it's important to know that many others were doing this at the same time. Rachel Carson was not alone in this. We have folks like Aldo Leopold and Barry Commoner and Lewis Mumford, a lot of different folks were trying to alert to different dimensions of this here. But it was Rachel's voice that broke through to the level of the public here in a way that others had not. And it's because of her life story and the way she brought so many different parts of her passions together, I think, that it's possible. So I want to look at this question of how did this happen? How did this very private, quiet, somewhat shy woman who initially wanted nothing more than being a life of a writer, and writing particularly about nature and the natural world, how did she become a public prophet known the world over? And what's the legacy that she left all this behind here? Now, in terms of my own family life, Rachel Carson was born about halfway between my grandparents and my parents. My grandparents were in the 1890s, my parents were born in the 1920s, and Rachel Carson was born in 1907. So he set the context. She's born in the decade right prior to World War I breaking out, which is going to be the unraveling of the kind of the modern European civilization project, and it's going to lead to World War I, the Great Depression, World War II. So her early years are set up in this great unraveling. Where she's going to be writing is in the period of great optimism in this country in the 1950s, which was seen as putting our country back together and putting the world back together. And it was a time of great hope, great optimism, great trust in science, great trust in technology. And she's going to sound a voice of alarm, of concern in the midst of this. So we want to take a look at the different things that have shaped what she brought to that. Born May 27th, 1907, her mother was Maria Carson, and her mother was in many ways Rachel's closest lifelong friend. She developed some very, very close friendships in adulthood, but Maria Carson was enormously influential on Rachel. Rachel was the third of her children, but she was quite a bit younger than her older brother and older sister, so she was raised largely with her mother, who took the job of really educating her quite thoroughly. Maria Carson was deeply influenced by and involved in what was at that time known as the nature study movement, which was the effort to try and get children out of the buildings and into nature and to study nature and to really kind of develop an emotional as well as a scientific understanding or attachment to nature. And so Rachel and her mother Maria spent hours, days and days. They lived on a farm, lived in a rural area, studying nature in that. And that helps to follow one side of Rachel Carson's passion for the natural world. She was just steeped in this right from the beginning. She also was a writer from as early as she can remember. Her first published article came at the age of 11. Right? She was already writing things and submitting them to different folks here. She says in one of her later memoirs, I can remember no time, even in earliest childhood, when I didn't assume I was going to be a writer. Right? And so this combination, these passions of writing and nature are going to come together for Rachel, particularly in her college years here. Now, as a student of theology, I have to point also, she was raised as a very strict Presbyterian. She had a good Calvinist upbringing, as did my dad. So I know the legacy of there. And but part of what this did was a couple different things in terms of the legacy of the Presbyterian Church, the Calvinism. One was a really strong kind of moral discipline in the sense of intellectual rigor, hard work, and study. And those really shaped Rachel Carson's character for her life long. She was a perfectionist. She would write and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite until she had everything done. She would study things until she understood things meticulously. So she formed very, very early on this deeply ingrained respect for the pursuit of intellectual rigor and study on things there. Also, deeply in part of the Calvinist tradition that she was involved in was this understanding that you could study the world of nature as a means of glorifying God, that these were not separated. In fact, later on, at one point when she was well established as a writer, a conservative Christian wrote to her and said, "How can you believe in evolution and call yourself a Christian?" And she said, "I see no contradiction between evolution and God. Evolution is simply the way that God's glory is manifested in the world." And this is a deeply ingrained kind of Calvinist sense there. So she got this Presbyterian heritage, love of nature, early exposure to writing that all come together. And her mother was determined that she was going to be able to build on this, and so they scraped the money together, and she got a scholarship to attend Pennsylvania College for Women, located just outside of Pittsburgh there. It was a women's college, and this became another important theme in Rachel's life here. She developed several strong women mentors here, but two in particular who are important to mention. Her first year there, she was introduced to Professor Grace Croft, who was the English writer there, and she quickly recognized in Rachel a talent for writing. And so she got Rachel involved in writing right away, writing for the school journal there, beginning to write articles that she could submit for publication elsewhere, developing a love of writing. And so Rachel declared an English major and assumed that she would pursue a career as a writer, even knowing that the opportunities for women were pretty limited in that area, but this was what her passion was, and she had the full support of her parents, particularly Maria. Her college was only 16 miles from where she grew up, so she spent virtually every weekend at home with her family and her parents, and again, very close relationship with her mother. But in Rachel's second year, she took a biology class with a professor named Mary Scott Skinker, who was a brilliant biologist, a very popular professor and teacher. The students were kind of in awe of her, admired her. She was young, she was dynamic, she was energetic, and Rachel fell in love with biology. And in fact, she switches from English to biology as her major here, even knowing that she will have very few opportunities career-wise as a woman in the field of science at this point. Simply, those positions didn't exist very much at all here. Mary Scott Kinker goes on to become a lifelong friend and mentor of Rachel Carson. In some ways prefigures her, dies at a fairly young middle age, also of cancer, several years down the road. But she ends up opening up several career opportunities for Rachel during this time here. A very interesting thing here, there's this love of writing and biology come together in Rachel's love of the sea, which is somewhat unusual because she had never been to the ocean. She had still not seen the ocean. Her first published article here is called the Masters of the Ship's Light there, and at the college level. But she was inspired by poetry, and particularly the poetry of Alfred Tennyson wrote in this. And so she developed this love of the ocean through literature. And connected to her love of nature through biology, but still had never seen the ocean, but began to write about it here, and that stoked her imagination quite a bit here. So she graduates from the college there, and then is determined to get a graduate degree. And she's going to get a graduate degree in zoology, focusing on oceanography or sea creatures. In summer of 1928, her mentor, Mary Skinker, spends the summer at Woods Hole Laboratory on a ship in Massachusetts there and inspires Rachel to do the same thing. So Rachel enrolls at Johns Hopkins University, where Mary Skinker has now gone to do or finish her doctorate. And the summer of 1929, she goes to marine biology lab at Woods Hole, Massachusetts. So it's the first time now she's seen the ocean. And this confirms for her a real love of things here. You will see part of what's astonishing about Rachel Carson's life, I think, is the levels of adversity she faced continually on the way, but she never let them get in the way or deter her from her lifelong passions. The 1929 stock market crash was one of these, was very significant. Not only did it make it very difficult for her to continue her studies, but her family lost all of its money. They lost their house. And so they all moved in with Rachel Carson, both of her parents, her older brother, her older sister, her sister's two daughters, into a small house in Baltimore. So Rachel was now beginning to shift to having to do financial responsibility for her family, but also continue her graduate studies. And this was set up a lifelong pattern for Rachel Carson of having to, always being under financial stress, or significantly under financial stress for the first 20, 30 years, and having family responsibilities. She finishes her master's degree. She wants to go into, get a PhD, again, knowing full well that she will have limited opportunities there, but she loves the work and wants to do this here. And so she begins PhD work, or doctoral level work, in 1932. But by 1934, financial pressures and family pressures have forced her to stop the program. She has to find work to be able to support the family. And then a series of family crises begin to take over. In 1935, her father dies. The family doesn't even have enough money to go to his funeral. They're able to ship his body back to Pennsylvania, where his sisters bury it, but none of them are able to actually attend the funeral there. Within 2 years, her older sister dies, leaving two nieces behind, and Maria and Rachel take on the responsibility now of raising these children. And so she's really in a difficult spot in terms of having to do financial support. It's at this point that her former mentor and friend now, Mary Skinker, comes in and encourages Rachel Carson to take the civil service exam and look for employment with the government civil service, which she does. Initially, she's not able to find work in this area there, but what she does find is that she contacts one of the program officers in the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries, and he is in despair because he has the responsibility of producing a 7-minute radio program every week about fish and making it interesting to people. And he's failed miserably. His screenwriters, everybody who comes up there, have not been able to find a way to educate the population about fish in an interesting way. So he gives Rachel a contract to produce fish stories, these 7-minute fish stories for him, and she succeeds brilliantly. And so he then asks her to write the introduction to a government publication, a document that's going to be coming out on fish. And so she goes together and she writes the introduction for it, and she turns it into him, and he calls her in the office and says, "I'm sorry, I cannot accept this for the government publication." And she's crushed initially. He says, but he follows her and he says, "This writing is far too good for a government document. I would like you to send it to the Atlantic Monthly." And so this becomes one of the encouragements for her that she really has a gift and talent for science writing in this area here. She waits another year to do this. In the meantime, she gets hired full-time by the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries, which eventually will become the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service there. But a year later, she does send this piece off to the Atlantic Monthly, which accepts it. And so it's published as the story Undersea in 1937. And gets very, very good response. And the Atlantic Monthly is widely read by the literary establishment here. And so several people encourage her to actually develop it into a book-length manuscript. And so while working full-time at the Fishery Bureau, And supporting her family and the two daughters there, she begins to work at night and on weekends to write this, turn this into a book manuscript. And this is where she and her mother Maria form a real partnership, because Rachel would write at night for several hours at night, and then in the morning she would go off to work and put in a full day of work, and Maria would take her manuscripts or whatever and type them. And so when Rachel got home in the evening, she had a freshly typed draft. She would continue working, editing, and they would continue this partnership up. So Maria really was her typist throughout this time, as well as helping to take care of her two nieces. In 1941, her first book comes out, Under the Sea Wind, and it has great, great critical acclaim. The only problem is timing. It comes out in November of 1941. About 3 or 4 weeks after it comes out, Pearl Harbor happens. And so it's quickly overlooked there. And while it was a critical acclaim, it was not a financial success. And it was deeply disappointing to Rachel, but it did establish her style of writing. It's a delightful book if you have a chance to go back and look at it, because she writes, this is a book about the oceans, but she writes it from the perspective of the creatures themselves. And she actually personifies them. She has, let's see if I can get the name, Freddie the Mackerel, and I should get the names down here. But anyway, she takes you through the story, their life stories, from the perspective of the particular creatures themselves. And so it's seen as a very successful book, but a commercial, not helpful. It does establish, however, though, as a major writer who's becoming known. And so in 1949, she becomes the chief editor of what's now the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So she's responsible for the editorial content and editing of all the publications there, a major, major position for her rising in her career at this time. It makes it even more difficult, however, for her to be able to continue to write. But she continues to write, and that becomes very important. And in 1951, 10 years after the Under the Sea Wind, she publishes the book, The Sea Around Us. And this one, and she was very nervous because shortly after she published it, the Korean War broke out. And so she was really fearful that the same kind of thing was going to happen. But in this case here, it became an instant success. It was serialized in the New Yorker. It spent 86 weeks, almost over a year and a half, as #1 on the New York Times list, sold over 1 million copies, and established her as a really, really strong new voice in the literary scene here. For Carson's perspective, what was really critical about this is it gave her financial independence. She finally was able, she had always in her life wanted to be a full-time writer. She now achieves that financial independence and is able to start writing full-time. So she resigns from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service here and begins to write full-time. And part of what I want to do tonight is just to give you a little bit of flavor of Rachel Carson as a writer. If there's anything that happens tonight, I hope you'll pick up some of her books and go back and read some of them. They're just quite beautifully written. So here's a little snippet from The Edge of the Sea. To stand at the edge of the sea, to sense the ebb and flow of the tides, to feel the breath of a mist moving over a great salt marsh, to watch the flight of shore birds that have swept up and down the surf lines of the continents for untold thousands of years, is to have knowledge of things that are as nearly eternal as any earthly life can be. And what Rachel Carson combined so brilliantly was she was a doctoral level scientist. She understood the science very, very well, and so it was very important for her to communicate scientifically accurate information. But she had had the voice of a poet, a voice of a novelist, and she combined these beautifully, and she opened up the world of nature, scientifically informed, but poetically expressed to many, many millions of people in there, and became very, very popular on that. One of her lifelong dreams was actually to be able to live near the sea. And so because of this financial independence, in 1952, she purchases a cottage in Maine, along the Maine coast there, that becomes known, she names it as Silver Ledge. And this will become very, very important. She will spend her summers there observing the sea. She would spend hours each day in the tide pools right below the cottage there. In the meantime, one of her nieces dies and leaves her a grandnephew, Roger, and so she ends up adopting Roger and raising him. He's about 5 or 6 at the time that his mother dies. And so again, the financial and family pressures continue, but now she has the means to do this. What she finds very challenging is the amount of time there. In 1955, she comes out with another book called The Edge of the Sea, which examines the tidal zones around continents, the edge of continents. There are 4 main areas around the globe. Again, very successful book, receives numerous awards, and establishes her further. Now she has 3 highly acclaimed books on ocean and writing there. As a result of spending time in Maine, Rachel Carson meets her soulmate, her dearest friend. There a woman named Dorothy Freeman, who Dorothy and Stan Freeman had the cottage next door. So it was just coincidental where she happened to buy this land there. I brought here there's a marvelous book that came out fairly recently called Always Rachel. And it's the unpublished correspondence between Dorothy Freeman and Rachel Carson. It's a massive, massive book. And we don't even have the complete works here because when Rachel Carson died, there had always been all these rumors. She was a spinster. She'd never married. Her closest friends were women, kind of things. And then in the McCarthy era, these were very damaging kinds of accusations. Her older brother was very concerned about it. He went through all her papers and he destroyed anything he thought might be too sensitive on that. So we unfortunately lost some of her papers there, but we still have an enormous amount of the correspondence. And what it reveals is the human dimension of Rachel Carson behind the public figure going through all this period here. So it's an extraordinarily informative period here. It also gave Rachel Carson finally a very dear friend, someone to have the emotional support and friendship as she was beginning to prepare to move into Silent Spring, and that will become a critical one. During all this time, Rachel Carson is focusing on nature writing. She's focusing on communicating the beauty and the reality of the oceans in particular here, but she's getting a sense of foreboding that all is not well in the process of this. And this comes about because she has this ecological perspective that all of life is interconnected and related, and she can begin to see some problems emerging here. As early as 1945, as the World War II is coming to the end there, we're just getting the earliest applications of DDT, which was largely a wartime chemical used by the military, but after 1945 will shift into the civil society. But she wrote a letter to Reader's Digest of concern about DDT, and a quote here, whether DDT may upset the whole delicate balance of nature if unwisely used. Inquiring whether Reader's Digest would be interested in some articles, Reader's Digest turned her down. And this will become a pattern. A lot of publishers were very leery of this because of a corporate sponsorship of particularly the very rapidly growing petrochemical industry. This became fairly personal for Rachel Carson very early on, although the connections between carcinogenic chemicals and cancer were only being speculated on at this point here. But already by 1946, before she reaches the age of 40, she has started to develop cysts in her breast, has a cyst and a tumor removed in 1946 and 1950. Parenthetically here, again, just talking about how different the social context was this time, this is still in the period of tremendous kind of medical paternalism, where doctors did not always tell you what was going on. Towards the end of their life, we'll find out that Rachel Carson's doctor had been lying to her about her breast cancer being malignant and had told her there was nothing wrong with it until it finally had so thoroughly metastasized he could no longer keep the truth from her, and by then it had proceeded so far that she was unable to do any treatment for it. But this sets up a sense already for her that what she's seeing in the world that's concerning her is beginning to be reflected in her own body. And she credits a letter from Olga Huckins, who was a woman who lived on Long Island who became deeply concerned with the effects of spraying campaigns on birds. Spraying for mosquitoes, spraying for the gypsy moth, the different things. But a lot of local people who were birders were noticing after spraying campaigns came through, the bird population plummeted. And so Olga Huckins had gotten a copy of Rachel's book, The Edge of the Sea, loved it, and she wrote her and said, I wonder if you are aware of these different issues that are going on here. And so she credits herself and writes back to her and says, the more information I collected about pesticides, the more appalled I became. Now, one of the things that's so interesting is to trace the evolution of Rachel Carson's thought on this here. When she wrote The Sea Around Us and wrote The Edge of the Sea, part of what she was trying to communicate was the immensity of the oceans that human beings should be humbled by, but it was too massive for us to affect deeply there. And she wrote in The Sea Around Us in 1952, and yet man has returned to his mother sea only on her terms. He cannot control or change the ocean, as in his brief tenancy on Earth, he has subdued and plundered the continents. She used her writing about the ocean to try to instill a better sense of humility, humbleness in human beings there, and thought that the ocean could teach us about this, because she saw it initially as so immense, so large, and largely inaccessible to human reach, that she didn't think it could be damaged. But 10 years later, she had changed her view on this quite a bit, as we were starting to see a lot of nuclear waste being deposited in the oceans, a lot of the effects of pesticides showing up, plummeting fish populations, a variety of different things. And so she wrote, this is the preface to the second edition of The Sea Around Us, "It's a curious situation that the sea, from which life first arose, should now be threatened by the activities of one form of that life. But the sea, though changed in a sinister way, will continue to exist. The threat is rather to life itself." So throughout the 1950s, she is developing this sense of foreboding about what is happening in the world around them, as many different people begin to contact her on this. Oh, I messed that up again. Hold on a second. Yeah, let's try it. So I think here, okay. Now, the critical context of what's going on here that will shape Rachel Carson's thing was the emergence of DDT in World War II. And I just put up here some of the different kinds of things which for many of us today are pretty astonishing to see people, the soldiers spraying civilians directly with DDT. You see on the beach there, the beach goes along there, and the DDT truck is going on. The machine, it says there, the machine is spreading a kind of fog of DDT spray to see if it will kill the mosquitoes and other insects on the beach. Outdoors, the spray soon thins out and does not harm people. And the sign over here, on this one here, says, "Powerful insecticide, harmless to humans." I don't know if any of you have memories of this. I talked to people from this period, and they remember running behind the DDT trucks and playing this kind of thing here, because the predominant information was this was harmless in this area here. And it rises out of an important social context of DDT. DDT was considered the magic insecticide when it was first there. It was first synthesized in 1874 in Europe. But it wasn't until 1939 that the Swiss chemist Paul Müller first discovers the insect-killing properties with no apparent harm to humans. And so this was seen as really critical, because this happened on the outbreak of World War II. And so from 1943 to 1945, there's massive use of DDT in the US military, with very, very important results. It prevented malaria, prevented typhus, lots of other insect-borne diseases, and was really critical to the US military success and the civilian population in places like the Southeast Asia and the Philippines, so forth on this. So DDT gained a reputation, a very, very positive reputation, as one of the chemicals that helped to win the war. And during the World War II, it was only available for military use. The military used all the production of it and applied to military things. But at the end of the war, DDT was transformed over into the civilian economy and primarily promulgated by US governmental agencies. And then also with the rise of the petrochemical industry, the close linkage between government agencies and private chemical companies here. And it was used initially in these public health campaigns. And it was so successful that in 1949, Paul Müller was given the Nobel Prize in Medicine. It's just very interesting to sort of think about in terms of our looking back today. But it really was seen as a miracle drug, and still used judiciously, is still used in places like Africa to help prevent DDT. So there's it's important to understand this is the context, because by the time Rachel Carson starts to write, this is the 1950s, the Eisenhower era, the era of optimism and hope, and all these things here. And so the discussion of DDT shifts to the war on, you continue the war language. If you look at the advertising, but it shifts to the war as now the war on pests on the home front. And you see lots of the U.S. Department of Agriculture campaigns against things like the fire ants, gypsy moths, mosquitoes, and so forth. The use of DDT peaks in 1959 when about 79 million pounds a year of it are being produced here. Very positive public image. DuPont sort of expresses it there. Their slogan was better living through chemistry. And you see this post-World War II confidence in the rise of science, technology, and chemicals to make life better, things there. But Rachel Carson and biologists who took an ecological perspective were beginning to notice one of the problems with DDT and other chemicals, insecticides, was the way it lodged itself in the food chain. And so she writes in Silent Spring, one of the most sinister features of DDT and related chemicals is the way they are passed on from one organism to another through all the links of the food chain. This storage of DDT begins with the smallest inconceivable intake of the chemical and continues until quite high levels are reached. The fatty storage depots act as biological magnifiers. So at every step of the food chain, its DDT is becoming more and more concentrated. And many of us are familiar with that in terms of what the effects it had on bald eagles. That became the most visible thing because of the shells of the bald eagle eggs became so thinned they couldn't hatch there. But she begins to notice about this. And so the encouraging of several folks, she decides in 1958 to write what Dorothy Freeman called the poison book. She's going to write this. Initially, she thought it would take her 3 or 4 months. She had this information to write down. She ended up spending 4 years on it here. She was very realistic right off the bat about the kind of opposition she had faced, because there's a very strong government-industry alliance at this point here. And so she begins to float the idea, and she's turned down by several publishers and magazines in terms of getting it out there. But eventually in 1958, Houghton Mifflin offers her a contract. And again, it will end up being serialized in the New Yorker, which will be really critical. Her working title was Man Against the Earth, trying to sort of, again, this kind of taking the image or the metaphor of warfare again here, that man was warring against the earth here. Instead of a few months, it took her over 4 years because of her very meticulous research, and she just kept getting in touch with more and more scientists. Part of Rachel Carson's concern was with the practice of science itself. Science was moving into the area of great specialization. And so you had lots and lots of experts in different areas there, but they didn't oftentimes talk to each other. And it was very difficult to piece together a holistic picture of things because people specialized so much in that. So she sought herself to both paint the big picture and then find a way to communicate it to people so that they could understand it here. So this painstaking gathering of evidence from this network of concerned scientists and citizens, and again, this is before Xerox machines, before the internet, before computers. I mean, this really was painstaking archival work there. At the same time, her own health is beginning to deteriorate rapidly. She has a radical mastectomy. The cancer is growing. Her doctor is still not telling her about the seriousness of it here. And so she's facing a lot of personal hurdles here. But she does get the Silent Spring serialized in the New Yorker here. And that's going to be part of the big breakthrough here. She dedicates it, she takes the title, as I mentioned, from Keats's poem, Silent Spring there, and she dedicates the book to Albert Schweitzer, and particularly his ethic of a reverence for life. She puts on the front piece this quote from Albert Schweitzer: "Man has lost the capacity to foresee and to forestall. He will end by destroying the earth." And saying, this is the trajectory we're on unless we change it here. Part of what Schweitzer and Carson had together in common was a reverence for life, but a reverence for all life. And so Carson is going to become a strong critique of what will emerge as what we know today as anthropocentrism, or human-centeredness, and argue for the value of all life. Okay, I'm actually going to get to Silent Spring here a minute here, but we're getting close. So this is chapter 1, and she opens the book by telling a fable called A Fable for Tomorrow. It's very readable, very short, worth reading here. And she has this line in here: "There was a strange stillness. The birds, for example, where had they gone?" She goes on to write, no witchcraft, no enemy action had silenced the rebirth of new life in the stricken world. The people had done it themselves." And then she asks, what has already silenced the voice of spring in countless towns in America? This book is an attempt to explain. So this was the opening chapter there. And it's quite skillfully done, because it appeals to small town America in the 1950s. She paints a picture of kind of a father knows best. If you remember that show there of small town America, Leave It to Beaver, kind of 1950s there. But she says there's something wrong with this picture. It's silent. There's no birds chirping. There's nothing else around. What's going on with us here, there? And that becomes her opening on that. Oh, again, I've got to figure out the wrong one here. Okay, so let's see. These are, by the way, these pictures keep flashing. These are all the really good books that are available. We'll eventually get to that. All right. I think we're getting closer here. There's Schweitzer. So let's try that. And try that. And I'll try to keep the right hand button. All right. Her second chapter is called An Obligation to Endure. And part of what I find so fascinating about Rachel Carson is that she breaks through scientific and nature writing to bring in a moral message. She's going to frame her arguments in terms of morality and ethics here. And so on page 8 of chapter Silent Spring, she says, along with the possibility of the extinction of mankind by nuclear war, another rising concern in the 50s, the central problem of our age has therefore become the contamination of man's total environment with each substance of incredible potential for harm. Substances that accumulate in the tissues of plants and animals and even penetrate the germ cells to shatter or alter the very material of heredity upon which the shape of future depends. This idea that this is altering our very genetic makeup and can be passed on to future generations was part of what was so alarming about this. And she quotes then Jean Rostand here at the end, the obligation to endure gives us the right to know. This is going to launch one of the really critical parts of the citizens' amendment of the environmental movement, that we have a right to the information about what's happening in the environment around us. It doesn't matter if there are trade secrets, it doesn't matter if the government considers it confidential. Citizens have a right to know when things are affecting us here. You start seeing references to Rachel Carson popping up all over in there, and I love this one here. Guy at the bar says, I had just come to terms with fallout, as in nuclear fallout, and along comes Rachel Carson. So these kind of growing cracks in the facade of the Eisenhower years there. Now, this here, I'm not going to go through all these here. This is the table of contents there. But what I want you to notice is a couple different things. First of all, you'll notice here, for those of you who are literature buffs, lots of literary references. Chapter 17 to Robert Frost, The Road Less Traveled there. You see chapter 8, No Birds Sing. There's the Keats poem here. She was deeply steeped in literature, and she was able to bring these to each of these chapters. So while each of these chapters focuses on particular environmental or ecological hazards, soil, water, pesticides, these are things, she wove them together and expressed them beautifully so she could educate her public in a way that was very accessible. So what's the main message going on in Silent Spring here? Several different sort of take-home points. First is, Rachel Carson wanted to have us really understand that we live in an ecological world, that all of life is interdependent. So we can't be tossing things in the environment without thinking it's going to affect all of life in that area there. She also has a moral or philosophical perspective. She argues for what we now call biocentrism, that all of life has value, not just human life. And we need to recognize the other forms of life have value there. She used this as a vehicle to begin to question the dominant paradigm of science plus technology always equals progress. And to say we really need to think carefully about the unintended consequences of this. And again, as I mentioned, she makes it accessible. She synthesizes and communicates an enormous amount of what had previously been compartmentalized scientific research and makes it available to the public here. Here's an example about how she was questioning not silence, but the practice of science in this time here. She says, we live in a scientific age, yet by a strange paradox, we behave as though knowledge of science is the prerogative of a small number of men, isolated and priest-like in their laboratories. This is not true. It cannot be true. The materials of science are the materials of life itself. Science is the what, the how, and the why of everything in our experience. It is part of the reality, excuse me, it is part of the reality of living. And that was in her acceptance speech for the National Book Award for The Sea Around Us here. But she's beginning to weave together these different kind of philosophical and ethical conclusions. This is the conclusion to Silent Spring, and I think it really sums up her message quite nicely, because what Rachel Carson is saying is we need a cultural transformation to deal with this. She writes, the control of nature is a phrase conceived in arrogance, born of the Neanderthal age of biology and philosophy, when it was supposed that nature exists for the convenience of man. It's our alarming misfortune that so primitive a science has armed itself with the most modern and terrible weapons, and that in turning them against the insects, it has also turned them against the earth. Okay? So as Albert Einstein also said, our ethics and our morality haven't evolved as quickly as our science and our technology, and that's a problem here. All right, very briefly, I want to go through how Silent Spring was received, and then we'll open it up for some discussion here. The opposition to Rachel Carson mobilized very quickly. In fact, mobilized before the book even came out with a threatened lawsuit against the New Yorker if they were going to publish her there. They attacked both the message of the book and the messenger. That should say messenger, not messenger. Sorry about that. So I just put a few quotes down here that give you a little sense about here. One reviewer said, I regard it as science fiction like The Twilight Zone, not actual science. So the science itself was called into question. A lot of legal threats here, particularly the Velsico Chemical Corporation had its lawyers contact New Yorker magazine and her publisher, threatened lawsuits on this. Very interestingly, within another year of publication, there was a major scandal of Velsico's contamination of its area there, so that quickly kind of died down that area there. A lot of attacks on her, according to her gender, some thinly veiled, some not so thinly veiled at all. One reviewer in a scientific journal titled his review, Silence Miss Carson. Another one called her hysterical woman. The Secretary of Agriculture under the Eisenhower administration, Taft, raised the question, why is a spinster with no children concerned about genetics? Right? So you saw all sorts of different kinds of things going on here. Political. This is the McCarthy, right in the wake of the McCarthy area here. People say Carson is probably a communist. She's an enemy of the American way of life. So a lot of what philosophers call ad hominem attacks attack the messenger as opposed to the message. But there were also quite a few people who raised questions about the science itself here. And this was one of the ones that became very well known. Robert White Stevens, who was a scientist closely associated with the chemical industry, in a hearing in front of Congress said, if man were to follow the teachings of Miss Carson, we would return to the Dark Ages, and the insects and diseases and vermin would once again inherit the earth. Right? So kind of painting apocalyptic scenarios, which were very much in vogue because of the nuclear kind of stuff going on here. Monsanto paid a ghostwriter to come up with a parody of Silent Spring called The Desolate Year. And I just wanted to give you a little snippet of it here. It was a parody of her opening chapter, the parable of tomorrow there. It says, quietly then, the desolate year begins. Not many people seemed aware of the danger. After all, in the winter, hardly a housefly was about. What could a few bugs do here and there? How could the good life depend upon something so seemingly trivial as bug spray? Where were the bugs anyway? The bugs were everywhere, unseen, unheard, unbelievably universal, beneath the ground, beneath the waters, on limbs and on and in limbs and twigs and stalks, under rocks, inside trees, animals and other insects, and yes, inside man. Right? This was the opening of this, and this was widely distributed there as kind of a means of sort of countering Rachel Carson there. But along with the opposition, she had a lot of support that began to mobilize very quickly here, particularly among scientists who were seeing this in their particular areas of specialty but weren't able to get the word out. A lot of strong groups of women, particularly gardening clubs. There were a lot of really interesting women's civic groups that saw Rachel Carson as a very powerful spokesperson and sponsored her in this. And of course, conservationists who were trying to draw attention to this from the effort to conserve things here. Second parallel to Uncle Tom's Cabin, William Douglas, then a member of the Supreme Court, said Silent Spring is the most revolutionary book since Uncle Tom's Cabin here. It received multiple honors. I won't even list them here, but National Book Award, Pulitzer Prize, so forth. One of Rachel Carson's most treasured awards that she received at this time is she was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Letters, which is limited to 50 individuals at a time there, and she was the only woman at this time to be elected to that. So because she'd always seen herself as a writer, that was, I think, for her among the most important. And a lot of public participation. Remember, this is back in the area of 3 television channels, CBS, NBC, and ABC. She goes on CBS there. They produce a special on there. She's interviewed with Eric Severide. So a lot of different things here and a lot of political fallout immediately. So I mentioned before, Senator Abe Ribicoff, you are the lady who started all this. President Kennedy was set up a commission to investigate pesticides. When asked why he was doing it, he was quoted saying, particularly since the publication of Ms. Carson's book, we need to do this. And she testifies in several congressional committees, also this picture here as of the President's Science Advisory Committee, 1963. This is at a point where her cancer has grown to the point where it's very, very difficult for her even to walk anymore. She's in enormous pain. Her health is failing very rapidly, but she's determined to get things out. And so in the last 2 years, she reaches the height of her fame at the same time that her body is simply collapsing now. By spring of 1962, when Silent Spring is published, her cancer is fully metastasized and spread throughout her body here. She still goes on to CBS, although Eric Sevareid has to come to her home to interview her. Doesn't have enough strength to leave the home, but she does make it to the President's Committee there. And then on April 14th, that should say 1964. April 14th, 1964, she has a heart attack and dies at the age of 57. But the fallout continues. There's a couple other things here. A short few years after Rachel Carson's obituary was dated, there was an obituary that appeared in the New York Times for DDT, which I think is pretty interesting. 1969, New York Times, died DDT, age 95, a persistent pesticide and a one-time humanitarian. Considered to be one of World War II's greatest heroes, DDT saw its reputation fade after it was charged with murder by author Rachel Carson. Death came on June 27th in Michigan after a lingering illness, survived by dieldrin, aldrin, endrin, chloridane, heptachlor, lindane, and toxaphene. Please omit flowers. Okay? Part of what happened in the wake of Rachel Carson was a dramatic growth in the regulation of pesticides and insecticides and chemicals there, although you can see the long list of the ones that are still legal, but DDT becomes banned in the US. Interestingly enough, not banned outside the US. So the production is not banned, the use is banned. And so a big export industry of DDT continues to grow, as it does with several other chemicals. But I just want to list a few of the things of Rachel Carson's legacy here as a means of cloning here. As a closing, as I mentioned, many credit her with really igniting the modern environmental movement, of really people paying attention to human beings live in an environment. And our environment can be damaged and poison that can have harm for us. By 1970, just 8 years after Rachel Carson's published Silent Spring, we have the first Earth Day and the creation of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. 1972, only 10 years after, we start getting the series of legislations, these amendments to the Federal Fungicide, Insecticide, Rodenticide Act, FIFRA, which actually dates to the 1940s. But responsibility is now given to the EPA to carry this out here. 1972, DDT is banned throughout the U.S. Other organochlorines are also banned during the 1970s, although still used abroad. A couple other things here. One of the things that Rachel Carson was doing towards the end of her life was really beginning to connect what's happening to the environment with what's happening to our bodies. And she became a real hero to the women's health movement as a result of this here. I have a quote here from Sandra Steingraber, who wrote a book called Living Downstream. She writes, from Rachel Carson, I learned how to make visible the intercourse between our bodies and the environments these bodies inhabit. There's a kind of exquisite communion between the external biological world we can see and the hidden one inside our skins that we know as self, but seldom get to look at. And by the way, Sandra Steinberger will be here this Friday is speaking at 7 o'clock at the Wilma. Women's Voices for the Earth is bringing her in. It should be a wonderful event. But this was really in the wake of Rachel Carson, this connecting the amount of chemicals we're putting in the environment to actually health in our bodies. And the women's health movement began to build on this and make this connect there. One last thing, there are lots of things we could talk about, but I think one thing that really came out of Rachel Carson's efforts was a rise of what's known as the precautionary principle. And this is simply that the indication of harm rather than the proof of harm should be the trigger for action, especially if delay would cause irreparable harm. We hear a lot about this as being invoked a lot today about climate change. Should we wait until we have definite proof that climate change is happening by human things there? The concern is if we wait that long, it may be too late to reverse it. Or should we operate on the indications that these things are happening there as a preventative process there? And Rachel Carson was one who really brought this to the attention of the American public. We've got to really operate on the indications of harm and preventative action, then wait until things are too late. So I wanted to just put it here, as I mentioned, Rachel Carson was definitely part of a much, much broader social movement, but she's also the indication about the impact of what one person can do. And I know most of you know this quote by Margaret Mead, but I think it probably really fits Rachel Carson. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. She really dedicated the last years of her life to making a difference when she knew she was dying. And all she wanted to do was to be at the ocean and spend time in the places that she loved, the people she loved there. So I'll leave you with a closing thought from Rachel Carson that I think is a challenge still that rings true for us today. Now, I truly believe that we in this generation must come to terms with nature. And I think we're challenged as mankind has never been challenged before to prove our maturity and our mastery, not of nature, but of ourselves. So I'll leave it with that here and look forward to engaging in more conversation with you. There's a hand back here.
Yeah, that was really great.
Oh, Chris, good to see you.
Yes. I'm just questioning this whether Rachel Carson really did launch the environmental movement. So it's really brief. You don't have to go into this. But I had heard that Edward Abbey's publication of Desert Solitaire and the Battle for the Colorado Dams was really what launched the environmental movement. I'm sure there's a lot of factors going on.
It's a really good question, and what I would say is what we see happening throughout the 1960s and then coming in the 70s is different wings of the environmental movement doing. And I would locate Edward Abbey really in the conservation wing and the wilderness preservation and attention to that element of there, which does begin to gain a lot of influence. In 1964, you had the Wilderness Act that passes. We have that whole movement, and particularly influential in the West. Rachel Carson is more in the environmental wing of the environmental movement that pays attention to pollution, to chemical to contamination, the more the human environment and what we're doing to that, but also the effects of that go on there. Earth Day was much more oriented towards what Rachel Carson brought together here. I remember I was in junior high, we put on our gas masks, we walked to the streets of Los Angeles protesting air pollution. It was really trying to draw attention to chemical contamination in that area there. And in fact, it caught many of the traditional conservation groups off guard, like the Sierra Club, the Wilderness League, these different groups in there. Since that time, we've had a lot of linking those together there, but I would say there really are multiple wings, and so you can trace back to Aldo Leopold, Bob Marshall, John Muir, that kind of conservation, preservation wing that Edward Abbey I would locate more in, and then Rachel Carson more in the anti-pollution, the human health kind of wing, but they do merge together in the 70s. Does that work? All right.
Another question. More questions. One right here, Jay.
Yeah. Thank you. That was a great presentation. If Rachel Carson were alive today, how do you think she would view this situation vis-a-vis the time in which the time just before she died?
Yeah.
Have we made significant progress? Is the environmental movement in good shape, or are we still fundamentally conflicted?
Yes. And no, it's an excellent question. I think Rachel Carson would be heartened by some things and discouraged by others. I'll start with the discouraging thing. There are far, far, far more chemicals around today and still in the environment. We've cleaned up some of the worst of them, but we still have the impetus of produce, apply, and then later test and see. The vast majority of chemicals that are out there don't get tested ahead of time. So we still are kind of playing Russian roulette with nature in that far, far, far more. Some of them, and of course we're now into not only chemicals, but genetic engineering, actual manipulation, things like that, things we just can't know the consequences of. So in that sense, there's still a lot of reason to be concerned and a lot of work ahead of us. In other areas, though, the legislation has made a huge difference. I mean, a lot of our waterways are cleaner. There are places, ways that we've her impact has made significant. Not only hers, but she drew our attention to this here, and I think we have a much more knowledgeable citizenry that pays attention to some of these different issues there. So it's a mixed bag. She helped attune us to the different problems and move in these different areas there. Those problems haven't gone away. And I'm smiling because I have a friend in the audience and a student who is usually very good at sticking up for corporations, and rightly so, because there are a lot of good things that have come out of corporations there. But corporations also still have a lot of power in this area here. So you saw Monsanto; they were the one who fostered the desolate year, the parody. Monsanto, 10 years ago, is also one that came up with the Terminator gene to make agricultural seeds and products sterile, so they can't be passed along in that area there. We see a lot of real concern with the decrease of genetic diversity in seed sources and things. I think Rachel Carson could have anticipated. I mean, she probably didn't see that that level of thing. So the industries have morphed into different areas here, and it's not to say that I should rush to add, Rachel Carson was not against technology, and she also was not 100% against pesticides and insecticides. She thought they had a use, but used judiciously, and not the massive application. And so there's been a lot of debate today about whether or not DDT should still be used in anti-malarial campaigns, because malaria still kills 1 million people a year in many poor countries. And so used judiciously, it could be really important on that. What she was concerned about, though, was this kind of shifting of our whole lifestyle into the massive uses without being aware at all of what the implications are. So I think she'd be heartened by some things, still sobered by others. That's my take on it anyway. Yeah.
Dan, I had both a comment and a question, really following up on the previous question about the two wings of the environmental movement, and there's certainly many others, but I grew up in Missoula, was born in Missoula, and grew up in the environmental movement because of my father, who was very involved, and I used to crawl out of bed and hang over the banister and listen to these battles between the people who were with Clancy Gordon, especially very concerned about the pollution issues, and then the Montana Wilderness Association, people who were fighting for the Wilderness Act and various other things in the 50s and 60s. And I formed a lot of my sense of how politics works and what leadership is from overhearing these conversations and battles. So I have a very personal interest in it, but I'm not as so clear now about the state of those wings of the movement and their relationship with each other. I'd be very interested in your sense of how that's developed and what the current condition is, but also how you see it in kind of larger terms about how any cause orientation tends to split and return in a kind of larger historical sense.
Well, if I could give just a very brief overview. The decade of the 60s was the decade right after Silent Spring, and that was the decade of rising awareness and consciousness. The decade of the 70s was the decade of legislation. That's when we got the EPA, we got the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. A lot of environmental legislation took place in the 1970s. Right? The decade of the 80s was the decade of backlash. That was when we had the Reagan administration coming in. Those of you in the West remember the Sagebrush Rebellion, the movement back against that area. The decade of the 90s, I would say, was a period of renewal, but in some different ways. One of the things that I thought was very promising that came out of that period that's still very much today, that I think is very much in the lineage of Rachel Carson, but wasn't present at her time, and that's the environmental justice movement. And environmental justice is the awareness that the people who are disproportionately affected by environmental issues of pollution and contamination are almost always communities of color and poor, low-income people. In fact, the #1 predictor of where toxic waste sites are located in this country is the color of your skin. Right? They just do a study. The United Church of Christ, my denomination, I'm proud of this heritage, in 1987 commissioned a study on toxic waste sites to see, is there any pattern? And the pattern was very clear. Toxic waste sites throughout this country are located in and adjacent to communities of color, because they're the communities that have the least political power. My colleague Robin Saha in Environmental Studies Department a few years ago was part of a 20-year look at this again called Toxic Waste at 20, and found that unfortunately the pattern hasn't changed that much. But there has been quite a developing grassroots movement around this. Now, I'm going to say something that is true in broad sense, but again, it's a bit of a caricature, so keep it in mind. The leadership and the energy in the traditional conservation and preservation movements was largely men. So you look back and you'll see John Muir, Bob Marshall, Aldo Leopold, Howard Sonneiser, Edward Abbey. So it's not to say there weren't women. There were some significant women, but it was a largely initiated male run. Interestingly enough, much of the movement of environmental contamination, particularly at grassroots, has been run by women. And it's not, when you investigate a little bit, it's not hard to see, because these issues of contamination affect children, they affect neighborhoods. So you have Love Canal with Lois Gibbs. You've got Wangari Maathai in Kenya, the movements there. These are movements that, because they are located in people's neighborhoods. And women oftentimes are the ones who would organize around these issues there. So the interesting thing is we have a gendered dimension to the environmental movement, the way it's evolved in that area there. What I find encouraging today is I think that's much less true. I think these are coming together in some really interesting ways. But it's where we're seeing the shift right now, what I would say here, and this is where we just have this, I think, a wonderfully energized new generation. We're seeing things like food, attention to food issues. So local foods, organic foods. We have, in our program, we have the Peas Farm, which is, and Missoula has the Farmers Market. There's a lot of attention to trying to say, what are we, how do we produce our food? Is that environmentally sustainable? And how do we consume it? Is that good for us in that area? Climate change, of course, is a huge one here. As I mentioned before, Rachel Carson was drawing attention to the pervasiveness of a chemical issue that was now affecting all of life on the planet. Well, climate change is one of these issues that doesn't know any borders, any national boundaries and stuff like that. So we see a lot of movement around that. So environmental movement you'll still find, obviously, people who are still working on conservation and preservation issues. We have the Tester bill right now about a new proposal for wilderness. I'm encouraged that I think there's more room for collaboration in some of these issues than historically we've seen. In our program, we have a lot of our work where we're working with ranchers. Historically, environmentalists and ranchers would not be found in the same room, but like groups like the Clark Fork Coalition, working with the ranching community in Deer Lodge, they're trying to find collaborationist approaches to address these issues there. So a lot of different things going on that I find very promising, but it's very challenging just because some of these issues have such a level of urgency and time is pretty short. I'm trying to control my teacher instinct and not call on people.
Let me just call on them.
You mentioned her nephew, Roger. Did she publish with him?
He was, Roger has been in charge of the archives largely, and he inherited the cottage there. But Roger Christie, I think, was only, I don't think he was even a teenager yet when she died. He may have been 11 or 12. He was still fairly young. And that was one of her real concerns when she realized that she was dying, was that her mother had died in the mid-50s. And so she was just her and Roger towards the end there. But she did make provisions for his care after his death. But he continues to be active in preserving her legacy and her archives there. Yeah. By the way, there's a wonderful DVD. I should have brought the information about it. There's a wonderful one-woman play that's been turned into a DVD of Rachel Carson at the end of her life and talking about that, and shows her relationship with Roger and them collecting the tide pools together and stuff. And there's a hand back here, too, for when we're done.
I just wondered what you thought about the role of education and the university as this trigger of action that was put up on the screen a while ago. And I was thinking about Wendell Berry's recent visit to the University of Montana, I think maybe it was 7 or 8 years ago, in which he said the trigger of action must come at the university. But he had some very deep concerns about the university as it's evolving towards more of a vocational institution rather than the kind of institution it used to be. And I think his comment was something like this, that the university is a place where all that is diverse needs to be brought into one universe. And we've lost the conversation between the disciplines. I just wondered what you thought about the role of education.
Well, it's an excellent question. It's very timely, and I actually happened to be at a philosophy forum this afternoon presented by our provost, Royce Engstrom, trying to address precisely this question about how do we have a unified and a unifying experience of the university, which still respects the respective disciplines, but that we're educating for community citizens, not just specialists in the field. And so there's some really good thinking about how to do this, and I think it's critically important. I mean, I think it's absolutely essential. I'm a professor of environmental studies. What do you think the most common questions I get from parents of prospective students? What kind of job is my child going to get? And I don't critique them, and that's a good question. They should be asking there, but it also reflects the shift of the university now as a workforce preparation institute in many people's minds. And oftentimes our funding is tied to a lot of this kind of thing too. You'll see it, and again, some of this is good. I mean, our governor has really been pushing and saying the universities have to be part of the response to Montana's economy. We have to be integrated in that, and I believe that. We are a public university. We're accountable to the state of Montana. We have to make our resources available to the economic well-being of Montana. But that's not the only thing. All right, there's much more that a university is about, and the traditional role of the university was the education of the citizenry, and I think that still has to be the heart of the university. So I very much agree with Wendell Berry in that, and how to negotiate that is always a challenge. I mean, if you look at this isn't always true, but if you look at the facilities on a university, compare the facilities where the biomedical sciences or the business school or things are taught to where the liberal arts are taught. And that will tell you a little bit about the funding sources in a university.
Somebody has a question right back here.
Maybe this sort of follows there, and maybe it's too personal, but I'm very curious as to what took you from the study of theology to the study of the environment.
That's a wonderful question. It's not too personal at all. It was a bit convoluted, and my father was very patient. My mother was not patient along the way, and she just wanted me to make up my mind and get out there. I love the natural sciences. I've always loved the outdoors. We're a family that grew up camping, so we spent a lot of time in the outdoors. So I've always been interested in the environment. What happened is when I went to Central America to study volcanoes, it was the late 70s and the early 80s. I loved the volcanoes there, but I became deeply involved in human rights issues. And the late 70s was a revolution was going on in Nicaragua. The early 80s, there were two terrible wars going on in Guatemala and El Salvador. And I was living in Costa Rica that was being flooded by refugees. So I became very interested in human rights and social justice issues, and I spent most of the decade of the 1980s working on human rights issues in Central America. I went to graduate school in 1989, and I got a really good piece of advice from my advisor, which was, your dissertation topic, just when you think you're done with it, other people are going to discover it. It's going to be with you a long time. So write about something you really find interesting, because it's going to be with you a long time. And I was very interested in how do we bring together these two dimensions, working for social justice with environmental sustainability. My field is ethics, so I'm interested in how we think about what's right or wrong or better or worse, or the moral dimensions of this. So what I worked on my doctoral work was trying to link both in Latin America and environmental issues, how do you integrate social justice issues with environmental sustainability? By the way, it's the centering question. Every year I take a group of students to Central America. And the orienting question that I organize these trips around is, how does a poor nation meet the economic needs of its people without exhausting the environment? So we'll look at that in Nicaragua, we'll look at that in Guatemala, and it's a really interesting question because it branches off into so many different areas there. I came to ethics through theology because of my active involvement in the church and my interest in that area there. Backdoor a little bit through philosophy. I never claimed to be a philosopher, but I try to understand that. But these issues of ethics, are really important to me, and that's what I find so fascinating about Rachel Carson. It goes back to your question over here, because she's trained as a scientist. But she lived her life as a humanitarian. She was a woman of letters. She was a writer. And so she brought this integration together in her very person. And she could have been quite content being a brilliant writer with lots of awards and gone to her grave having to live a rich life that way. But she was first and foremost a public citizen who was deeply concerned about the earth here. And so she took these skills, these two branches of the sciences and the letters, and combined them to become this public advocate. And for me, that's probably the quintessential model of someone. And of course, obviously a great, great personal cost to herself. I mean, that's a part of the story that makes it so compelling here. So it's a wonderful question. I don't pretend at all to be following in the footsteps of Rachel Carson, but I had a quip when I was in my graduate studies that followed me there. I made this little quip one day in chapel. And then it sort of just stayed with the rest of my studies there. And I just simply said, if the world weren't so messed up, I'd really be a very happy geologist. And I would have been so happy being a geologist, because that was always my first love, and I still love geology, and I love living in Montana where the geology just is everywhere. But I ended up moving in other directions because the world's pretty messed up. Yes?
Now on all that you've talked about, it's hard for me to... I've always thought that a university should not be a trade school. And, you know, we've got state colleges for that, or junior colleges for that. But, and what you've talked about, Rachel Carson, she didn't study the environment for a trade, you know, so I don't know. I don't have, I guess, the specific question. But how does the university, I think the university has to strive to be not a trade school.
And I would say I agree with you 100%. It's one of the things I really love about the University of Montana. I myself came out of a liberal arts college, a small liberal arts college, and I kind of got deeply imbued with the vision of a liberal arts education. What amazed me when I got to the University of Montana is I think that vision still largely fills the University of Montana. Even though it's a larger research university, it has the heart of a liberal arts institution, and it has that heritage, whether it was Henry Bugby in the philosophy department or these really giants over the years. We have a faculty that I think is still largely dedicated to this. But the challenges are the broader context. There's two trends that I see that are really difficult. One is I would increasingly see is the commodification of education, where education is seen more and more of a commodity. And you hear this creeping in the language, where students are to be treated as customers, and they have a right to have their, they're paying they have the right to have, to keep the customer happy. And we feel these pressures as professors and administrators. I think that's the wrong way to frame a university, but those pressures are there. The other one is the labor pressure, the workforce pressures. These pressures that we have to make our education practical. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, education should be able to do this, but a practical, broad education is much more than job training. And so we have to find a way to make sure that the students have the skills they need to make the contributions in society, in their jobs, in their communities, and whatever. So the skill set's really important. But they also need to be able to think thoughtfully, critically about ethical issues. The dean of the Davidson Honors College is right here, and part of what I love about the University of Montana, we have an honors college that also helps to keep the heart of the liberal arts education alive and flourishing in the midst of the university. So I'm quite hopeful about the University of Montana. I think we have a brilliant provost. I hope he's not here. I don't want to. And we have a wonderful associate provost right here. He has a brilliant staff as well. But we really do. I mean, I've taught at other places there, and I've been at other places where you don't have it. It really makes a difference when you have that kind of academic leadership at a university. And so I think we have it here. And there's budget pressures, there's all sorts of other pressures, but I think we've got the ingredients to keep that alive. I really hope we do anyway.
One more question, right back here.
Yeah.
Did Rachel Carson maintain her relationship with organized religion, or did the kind of non-Christian response drive her away from that?
She did not. She always she did not maintain an active church-going presence in that. Her mother was much more active in that, and she was respectful of that. I would say that what she retained was the reverence for nature, the reverence towards the broader thing, and she never denounced by any means her religious upbringing. She spoke quite freely from a theological perspective. So like when she was challenged and called an atheist, she would quite say, I'm not an atheist, and I don't see any contradiction to this. But she didn't maintain an active religious presence. And so how she would have named that for herself, I don't really know. But she kind of moved out of that kind of strict Presbyterian upbringing. I suspect, frankly, part of it may also just have been time. She was just so strapped for time between her working full-time, raising these family members, and then she spent every available minute writing on that or trying to be outdoors. But she clearly moved away from her Presbyterian roots, kind of maintaining the ethics, but away from the theology side of it.
Okay, can we let that be the last question? And thank you.
Thank you all.